So we ended episode 5 in 1987, the early beginning of 87, when I say goodbye to the career as a school teacher and basically left that little village, Olshanka, and I remember I went traveling, trying to find a way to basically, I desperately wanted to get out from that Kirovograd where I grew up, right? And I think first I went to a big city that's now called the Dnipro, but back then it was called Dnepropetrovsk, because the sister of my wife and I got married when I was a teacher there. So the sister lived in that Dnepropetrovsk, and it's a much bigger city, much more dynamic city than Kirovograd, where my parents were. And what I did is I went to, I was trying to get a job and settle down. But back then, I mentioned this before a couple of times, this kind of like a prison system in the Soviet Union was that you cannot get a decent job unless you have a residency permit, which in Russian was called propiska. So if you don't have that stamp in your passport, and we carried our passports everywhere because a cop would stop you, and if you don't have a passport, they can throw you in jail. So everybody had to have a passport. And driver's licenses were never considered a form of ID. And so I was really surprised, by the way, when I moved to Canada, that everybody was asking for a driver's license. Back in the Soviet Union days, driver's license was nothing. It was just your driver document. So when people were talking about ID, they were talking about your passport, which, as I mentioned, you had to have on you at all times. Women, men, basically anybody older than 16, because you got your passport at 16. And so I traveled to Dnepropetrovsk. I left my wife there, left my job, and I stayed for a few days with her sister. And my dream was always to work on the railroad, right? And so Dnepropetrovsk had a railroad school, technical school, where you can go and take a course for like 1 year, 2 years, right? And I remember I went in. So this is 87. I think they were high. The year was starting in the spring or something. I'm not sure how it, like, about the timing, because I did enroll later in the railroad school, but in a different, like near Kirovograd, there was a small town called Znamenka. But anyway, first I tried this one at Dnepropetrovsk, and I wanted to try my luck at becoming a railroad engineer, basically the train driver, And when I was coming in, when I was talking to the lady in admissions, I said, hey, I just want to be a porter, provodnik, a porter on passenger trains. And she said, well, you're so a nice, handsome guy. And what, you wanna be cleaning toilets? Because porters in the Soviet Union, they were responsible for cleaning the car, between trips. So you were supposed to sweep the floors, of course, clean the bathroom, stuff like that. There was no dedicated crews, it was a job of the porter, one of the jobs, right? And so she says, so you're such a nice, handsome guy, you want to be cleaning toilets. Why don't you apply for training as a train engineer? And I said, well, I'm not sure about that, because I knew, the issue with my eyesight, right? That's why I never became a pilot. Otherwise, that would be my number one choice. But this lady, she says, well, why don't you try? And right there, they had a medical. So they had all the doctors right there at the school. And I remember I thought, let's get it over with. I'll go and check my eyesight first so that I don't waste time if they tell me, no, you must have 100% vision. But I go there and the eyesight guy was on lunch. And so they told me, go check with all the other doctors. And so I do all the other doctors. I pass, everybody else, like, your general, condition, your heart, your blood pressure, your nerve system, everything, right? And then the last one, I still remember this. It was so humiliating. So the last one was this eye doctor. And by the time I finished all the other doctors, he was back from lunch and they told me, yeah, okay, you have one spot left on your medical, which is the eye doctor. You should be fine, just go. And I go there, and of course the guy just kills me. He says, no, I cannot sign this. He says, because if something happens and you end up in an accident on the railroad, they're gonna come back and look at my paperwork. So he said, basically, I asked him, can you just cheat a little? Like, what's the 100%? I'm like 90% one eye. It's perfectly fine for nowadays for everything, right? But he says, no, I cannot do anything, I'm sorry. Basically, he says, I don't want to go to prison if you get into an accident. And so I go back to the admissions and I say, that's it, I'm not doing it anymore, because they cut me down. And the same lady who told me that I don't want to be cleaning toilets, she says, okay, so they didn't approve you for the engineer, so why don't you try for a porter as you wanted? And I said, what, you want me to clean toilets? Basically, screw you, lady. So I was so pissed off, and I left. And then my wife's sister was getting upset with me because, she saw that basically I left my wife over there in that old Shanka, but, we were kind of like falling apart anyway, because of some cultural and language differences, And so after that, I think I traveled to Baltic republics for some reason, because, Latvia was still part of the Soviet Union. And I took a train. Not sure where I got the money. I think I sold the wedding ring I had. And so I went there and I tried to find any job where they would give you propiska, the residency permit, because actually some places, if the job was really like they needed people, they would give you the kind of like a dormitory for workers, like where you can sleep, and then that becomes your address. They put a stamp on your passport, so they give you this residency permit. And these guys, one of the jobs that could do that was to be a bus driver in Riga, Latvia. It was a kind of like electric bus, like a trolleybus we called it. And so you go, they train you, and if they take you, you get the living accommodations. And the only problem is, the only problem, they still wanted you to get the permit first. Yeah, so these guys, they did have accommodations, but still, first, in order for you to be considered, you needed to have that stupid residency permit. And I found one lady that was willing to kind of like take me as a tenant and give me this residency permit, but she wanted, I think, like 5,000 rubles, basically, which was like $5,000. So I called my parents. I said, hey guys, can you help me out? And they're like, are you crazy? $5,000, come home. And so I traveled back. Nothing happened in that Latvia. So basically, this time, this 87, it was all kind of like searching how to get out of that Kirovograd where I grew up, because I was so sick and tired of that city, I wanted to go somewhere. And so on the way back, the train stopped in the Znamenka, which was the suburb of Kirovograd, and it was a big railroad junction. And I knew that they had a railroad school there. And so I went there, and this was already like late spring, I think. And I registered for a course as a porter. I knew not to bother with a railroad engineer because they had that one. And it was just like a 1-year course, but they also had this porter, railroad passenger trains, basically customer service representative, porter. It was a 1-year program, so they accepted me. And when the studies started, I was amazed to discover that the scholarship was like 70 rubles, whereas when I was in the university, the scholarship was only 40 rubles. So basically it was almost double. And of course they suspected that because I was much older than everybody else, they suspected that I already went to another institution, educational institution, because back then they were not happy when, let's say, you go to university and then you go to a technical school, because the government already spent so much money on you because it was all free, right? Even the university was free, and they paid me that 40 ruble scholarship. But I told them, hey, I said I worked as a teacher in that village school, and when they asked me how I ended up as a teacher, I said, well, it's these village schools, they're always short of teachers, and I just happened to study English, so I knew English, and they hired me as a teacher. And they were okay with that. So it was very interesting. I loved that time of my life, studying about railroad cars, railroad signals, engines. I always loved the railroad, And then we had some practical at the end of the year. So like I said, it was only 1-year program. At the end of the year, we had some practical assignments where they put us on a train with an experienced porter, and we were just kind of like shadowing them, and like in a real situation on the train. And so yeah, it was pretty cool. And so I started working. When I finished, of course, I started working in the same Znamenka. Mostly it was our Kirovograd-Odessa train, basically a local train that just ran through the night. And again, I desperately wanted to get out of that Kirovograd. So whenever I was on the train, I would talk to anybody I could if there was any chance of me getting to, let's say, Odessa, which was a much bigger city on the Black Sea coast. And that's where our train was going there, right? And Odessa was a beautiful city, there's no comparison between Odessa and Kirovograd. And one day I ran into a guy, one of the passengers on my train was a priest, and he said he knew this lady who lived in a suburb of Odessa, and she worked at the Pasportny Sto, which is like a passport department of the local municipality. And he said, I believe she can help you, And he arranged a meet. And when I was in Odessa on a layover, I went to see the lady, and she didn't want any money, but she said, okay, I'll give you the residency permit, but you have to live here at my house. So basically she wanted to keep an eye on me, because she was afraid that if I do something stupid, like, I don't know, steal something or kill somebody. Anyway, so she wanted to keep an eye on me, And so she gave me kind of like free accommodations at her house. I'm telling you, these were like strange times, And once I got that propiska, I was able to get a job at the Odessa, on the Odessa Railroad, basically based out of Odessa, because again, Odessa was a huge railroad junction with lots of trains going out, so much bigger than Znamenka where I was before. But the main condition to work there, you needed to have the residency permit, right? It was like such a stupid system. And so once I got that permit, I went and applied at Odessa. They hired me. I became a porter, and most of the time they put me on this nice Odessa Moscow train. It was like a fast train. And so my job was, check tickets, sell beddings. It was like 1 ruble, $1 for a set of beddings, because it was the train ran, I think, like 24 hours, because it was 1,000 kilometers from Odessa to Moscow. And then of course I served tea. There was no coffee, tea, and I cleaned up the car, when we were in Moscow, and then back when we were in Odessa, and I took care of the heating. Surprisingly, this was 87, 88, 89. All the cars had a furnace, and so you had to feed coal, like at when we were back home, there were guys in a truck and they would give you buckets of coal, and there were special compartments there for coal. And so you always had to keep an eye on that furnace, because it's like a big, oven. And of course, quite often it would either go out, the fire would go out, or it would be too hot in the car. People would start complaining. I'm talking about in winter. Of course, in the summer you don't do it, right? People can open windows, but I don't think we even had any air conditioning in those. All the cars were made in Germany. They were nice, passenger railroad cars. There was like, mostly the typical one was, it had 9 compartments, and each compartment had 4 beds, 4 bunks. And people would just, if there was like men and women, sometimes they would ask the porter, me, to switch with somebody so that there's only women in one compartment or men. But it was a common thing, strangers sleeping in the same compartment. And so, it was 36 people. This was like a more expensive option, coupe. It was called coupe, like a coupe, like a car, right? Coupe, because you had your own separate room for 4 people. And the other one was kind of like an open concept, where there was other seats in the aisle. It was, instead of 36 people, that car could carry, I think, 52 or 54, something like that. But there was no walls. Everybody slept. You would have to change your clothes under the when you're on the bed, when they turn off the light. So it was kind of like weird, gypsy style, but it was great fun. We had uniforms, so I was in charge of my car. There was lots of girls. There was lots of, overnight, stands. Man, this was a happy time, But I had no clue what I was doing in terms of financial direction. I was making good money because there was, it was like kind of like gray economy, you would make some money under the table. And I always came back we worked like, I think 2 weeks. We worked 2 weeks and then we were 1 week off, right? And I always came back with, money, but then I spent it. I would go to restaurants, movie theaters, spend them on taxis, and then when I would start a week later, I literally had like a couple of bucks in my pocket, So I was stupid, I never saved anything. And I was surprised when I met a girl there and we kind of fell in love, because by this time I was already divorced from my wife. I did that kind of like through a lawyer when I was a student at that technical school. And so this lady, she also worked as a porter, but she was so focused on getting her own place. She was saving every ruble, and she told me that, I already have I think she had like 10,000 rubles, and she needed like 11 to buy her own little room in a communal apartment. You know, it's like basically one weird thing they had in the Soviet Union, that you owned a room in an apartment, and there were like, you know, 6-8 people, basically 6-8 rooms in this kind of like community flat, you know, community apartment. And you shared the kitchen, you shared the bathrooms. It was weird, but that was like the cheapest way to get into this real estate game, is to buy this communal, you know, kind of like a share in this communal apartment instead of having your own apartment, you know. But it was okay. Lots of people lived like that. And so this girl had focus. I was just enjoying life, you know. It was a lot of fun. A lot of fun. Like I said, lots of girls. You know, I was, what is it, 87, so I was like 25. I had all my hair, you know, all my teeth. I was a handsome guy, you know. Of course, after the army, I was in very good shape, you know. So girls were easy to find. And so I had that residency permit for 3 years, and then all of a sudden this lady where I lived, the passport lady, right, who gave me this fake permit, she said that she was hoping I would get married, or I would have found a way, you know, of somehow moving to a real place. And so after 3 years, she said, Sergey, okay, I'm gonna give you a month, and then I'm gonna cancel your residency permit. And so she did that, and pretty much I lost my job, because, you know, they were extending, I think, the contract every year. You had to stop by the human resources and just, you know, update your information. And they would ask for your passport to double check that you still have the residency permit. And because this stupid lady, she killed my permit during the next update I had to do at the human resources. You know, there was nothing I could do. They asked me for my passport, and it says basically moved out, right? So no residency. And so they didn't renew my contract, and that was the time where I had to basically hide my tail between my legs and return to my parents, because I couldn't get a job in Odessa, right, without that stupid permit. And here, when I returned, of course, they were not too happy to see me, because, you know, it was a 1-bedroom apartment, or like 2 rooms, 2-room apartment, 1 bedroom. And my brother, I think, was already in the army, but still, you know, they were used to kind of like having a freedom of extra space, and now this guy comes back, you know, and I'm like, what, 25, 26, and I want to live again with my parents, but I had no job, I had no choice, so I tried to, I think I work in advertising, I tried to sell insurance. I found a guy who was kind of like a hypnotizer, you know, hypnotiseur. He had this stage act where he would play tricks with people, you know, using hypnosis. So I was kind of like his promotion manager, dealing with marketing and advertising. And then eventually I ended up, I mentioned this before, that we had 3 universities in Kirovograd. One was that agricultural engineering school. One was pedagogical university, where I went to learn English. And the last one was the pilot school. It was a 5-year school where they trained civil aviation pilots, right? And I got a job with these guys because I learned how to type, you know, like I learned blind typing. I really enjoyed typing. So I learned blind typing. I was good with computers, you know, and I spoke English. And so they hired me as I don't remember the exact title, but it was in the marketing department, basically. And marketing department they were one of the programs at this university was retraining, and they made a lot of money on this because the school charged airports. Let's say an airport had a pilot who only knew how to fly a single engine plane, and these guys had a training for a two-engine plane, right? And so back then there was no cash, but I think it was all biznal, as we call it, like wire transfer. So the airport would pay the school to train this guy, and so the marketing department was, to market our services as a training facility for people to switch to bigger planes. So it was pretty cool. They gave me a uniform. I looked like a pilot in this blue uniform, blue pants, blue jacket, and kind of like a military style hat. And I think I worked there for like 5 or 6 months. Oh, and the best part is that they had their own kind of like a hotel, like a dormitory, And so they gave me a room in there. It was like very cheap, and so finally I was able to get out of my parents' apartment, and they gave me the residency permit. And I was still not happy in that town of Kirovograd. My big plan ever since I was a kid was to get out. And so I was looking for ways to get to Moscow, because I realized that back then, like the Soviet Union was falling apart, and there was lots of opportunities for business people. There was lots of companies being formed. It was crazy, kind of like wild west. And Moscow, being the biggest city in Russia, in the Soviet Union, was kind of like a magnet, for people like me, and I was interested in making money. And so I met a girl who also wanted to move to Moscow, and this was I met her in somewhere in like middle part of USSR, like Abkhazia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, because at that time I wanted to marry kind of like a Middle Eastern type of girl, and kind of like Russian, Georgia, Armenia, that kind of stuff. And so, but anyway, she was Russian, and her mother somehow had a connection in Moscow, right? And so we kind of like cooperated with this girl, because, not like lovers or boyfriend and girlfriend, but just trying to help each other, because she did not know anybody over there except her mother was kind of like flying in, flying out. And so finally I was planning this move to Moscow, and it happened in 1992. In 1992, I quit my job at the aviation school, and by that time, Ukraine already had its own money. Ukraine was already its own kind of like independent country. And by the way, one of the reasons why I left when I did was because, we still had all of us still had passports, which is ID, right? Not driver's license, but your passport was the ID. All our passports still said Soviet Union on them, USSR, SSSR in Russian. And Ukrainian government gave us all kind of like an ultimatum. They said that, these passports are going to expire after 1 year or something like that. So basically, either you move out or you become a Ukrainian citizen. And I really didn't want to do that, even though, I spoke Ukrainian, I could read Ukrainian, but, I'm Russian, my parents are from Russia, and that was kind of like the last straw why I really wanted to leave Ukraine, because they said, you cannot live here with that Soviet Union passport. And so when I met this girl, and we decided to help each other, so 1992, I finally left Kirovograd, and I moved to Moscow, where I spent an exciting 5 years, and then in 97 I moved to Canada. But 92 to 97 was a really amazing time. But from this period, 87 to 92, I really fondly remember my work on the railroad, where I learned the basically basic capitalism. It was all kind of like a gray under the table economy, Like one of the things we did, of course, every passenger train had a restaurant. Kind of one of the cars was a restaurant. Like there was no sleeping compartments. It was just tables, and there was a waiter, a waitress, and of course they sold alcohol. But everybody knew that porters sold alcohol under the table, especially when the restaurant was closed, like at, I don't know, they closed like at 10 or 11, and then people, of course, would bring booze on the train, but they would finish it, and then late at night, like 11 o'clock, you see these, smashed out characters walking around asking for booze, And what you would do is, back then, I still remember, a bottle of vodka was 10 rubles, or let's say $10, same thing. But that was 10 rubles when you go to the liquor store. But on the train, the price was double. It was 20 rubles, right? And so that's how we learned the system of capitalism. So before your shift, you would go to the liquor store, you would buy 2, 3, 4 bottles of vodka for 10 rubles each, and then on the train you would sell out for 20 rubles each. Of course, it was not technically legal, but everybody did it. That was one of the ways a porter would make money. So it was all kind of like shady stuff. And actually, one of the reasons also, I wanted to leave even before my kind of like residency permit was canceled by that crazy lady. But I wasn't comfortable with all this, bribery and all this shady things we had to do. But it was interesting, for a young guy in his, 25, 26 years old, Sometimes I thought I would write a book about my sexual adventures. Because it was crazy. It was crazy. I never knew what women would agree to, even when they had, boyfriends, husbands. But once they get on the train, something happens. They forget about all the limitations. All you have to do is just, I had a tape recorder with some music. I would have some wine, and of course I had my own little compartment for the porter. So yeah, it would be crazy. Like here in Canada, it would be totally unacceptable. But back in Russia, it was, people were having fun. So it was all cool. But anyway, so I started in 87, this segment, when I left the school and I started traveling through the country looking for opportunities of how to get out of that Kirovograd and get a job somewhere and get a residency permit. And we finished in 92, where I finally was able to leave that Kirovograd behind and move to Moscow with my friend. And we were able to find an apartment, and that's where basically my career direction changed dramatically, and I became a real estate agent in Moscow, Russia. And then eventually opened my own little business, and that's how I made money to come to Canada. But this was episode 6. We're gonna talk about 92 to 97, which were also like amazing years in my life. I still remember everything, even though this was almost 30 years ago. We're gonna talk about that, about my life in Moscow and my business ventures in episode 7. Thanks for watching.